My name is Claire Bennett, and most days I smell like coffee beans and burnt toast. That's what happens when you work long shifts at a small cafe tucked between a laundromat and a failing bookstore. I'm 34 years old, a single mother raising my 7-year-old son in a 2-bedroom apartment that's too small for his growing legs and too expensive for my shrinking wallet. After my divorce 3 years ago, I promised myself I would rebuild slowly, step by step. But some nights, when I'm counting tips in the dim kitchen light, I wonder if I've been walking in circles instead. The cafe isn't glamorous. Chipped tiles, a flickering neon sign, a coffee machine that coughs more than it purrs. But it keeps us afloat. It's also the reason I discovered the rooftop. After closing shifts, when my back aches and my apron smells of milk that boiled over one too many times, I need a place to breathe. My apartment walls close in on me, with the fridge rattling like a sick dog and my son's school papers covering every inch of the fridge door. So I climb. Up the narrow iron stairs, through the heavy door that sticks in the summer humidity, onto a rooftop that feels like a secret no one else has claimed. It isn't pretty. The tar is cracked, the railing is a little too low to inspire confidence, and an abandoned satellite dish lies in the corner. But up there, the city opens itself to me. I can see the river glinting under yellow streetlights, the blur of taxis weaving through intersections, the faint pulse of music from bars still alive at midnight. It's the only place where my life doesn't feel like it's shrinking. On that roof, I can pretend I'm bigger than my bills, my broken marriage, my mistakes. That night, I leaned against the ledge with a paper cup of lukewarm coffee, my unofficial bonus for working late. My hair clung to my neck from the kitchen heat, and I was busy rehearsing the conversation I'd have with my landlord about delaying rent again, when the door creaked behind me. For a second, I thought it was Mrs. Alvarez, the neighbor who once tried to dry her sheets up here until the wind carried them into traffic. But the footsteps were heavier, more deliberate. A man appeared. Not the kind of man you expect in this building, with its flickering hallway lights and perpetually broken elevator. He was tall, well-built, with dark hair neatly cut, his shirt crisp like it had never known the inside of a laundromat. He walked to the opposite side of the rooftop, rested his hands on the ledge, and only then glanced at me. His gaze was steady, not intrusive, and his voice was calm when he finally spoke. Didn't think anyone else came up here. Same, I answered, gripping my cup. It's my escape hatch. He gave a short laugh, quiet but genuine. Escaping from what? I shrugged. Everything. Work, bills, my fridge that sounds like it's dying. That made him smile. A small one, but real. Sounds like a war zone. Single mother versus domestic appliances, I said dryly. Take your bets. He chuckled, and suddenly the rooftop didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt shared. That unsettled me. I wasn't used to company in my sanctuary. My life was already crowded with obligations, morning rushes at the cafe, after-school pickups, endless grocery lists. I wasn't looking for another presence, especially not one in a pressed shirt who seemed like he belonged somewhere better. I drained the coffee, crushed the paper cup in my fist, and dropped it in the bag I used as a trash bin. Well, I said, brushing crumbs from my apron, enjoy your sky. I was halfway to the door when his voice followed me. You work at the cafe downstairs, right? I stopped, surprised. Yeah. How do you... I came in yesterday morning. You made me a cappuccino. You looked like you didn't believe in foam. I laughed despite myself. I believe in foam. I just don't believe in people yelling because their foam looks like Mount Everest instead of a meadow. His smile deepened, softening the sharpness of his features. He hesitated, as if deciding whether to offer his hand, then left it on the ledge. I just moved in, top floor. Lucky you, I said. Penthouse view without the penthouse rent. He held my gaze longer than strangers usually do. Then he turned back to the skyline. Something like that. I left before the conversation could deepen, descending the stairs with my pulse quickened in a way that had nothing to do with caffeine. Just a neighbor, I told myself. Just another face in a building full of them. But when I tucked my son into bed later that night, I caught myself thinking about the stranger on the rooftop and the way his smile lingered in the city lights. And for the first time in months, I lay awake, not because of bills or worries, but because of the memory of someone new. The morning rush at the cafe is a beast of its own. By 7:30, the line is already curling toward the door. People in suits tapping their phones, like the caffeine in their veins depends on how quickly I can steam milk. I've learned to move like a machine, left hand pulling espresso shots, right hand juggling cups, my voice calling orders over the hiss of the steamer. Most customers don't look at me. Their eyes on their screens, or their watches, or the person they're late to meet. But every once in a while, I get someone who sees me, not in the I want to flirt way, but in the I recognize you're human way. That morning, the stranger from the rooftop stood in line with his sleeves rolled to the elbows, a clean tie knotted at his collar. I almost dropped the cup I was holding. He looked different in daylight, less mysterious, more like he belonged to the polished world I usually only glimpsed from behind the counter. Yet he smiled when he reached the register, not in the polite way people do when they're forced to, but with a flicker of recognition. "Claire, right?" he said. I froze for half a beat before nodding. "Right. And you're rooftop guy." That made him laugh. A deep, easy sound that made the woman behind him glance up from her phone. "Ethan," he said, offering the name like a bridge. "I figured I should introduce myself properly." I typed his order into the machine, partly to buy myself a second. "So, Ethan, same cappuccino as yesterday? Foam Meadow, not Everest?" "Exactly," he said. "You're a fast learner." "Years of training," I replied dryly. When he moved to wait at the pickup counter, I caught myself watching him from the corner of my eye. There was something about the way he carried himself, calm but attentive, as if he didn't need to prove he belonged anywhere. It made me wonder what someone like him was doing in a building like ours. "Mom," a small voice called. I turned to see my son, Ben, seated at the corner booth, his backpack sliding off the seat beside him. I let him sit in the cafe for half an hour before school on the days my shift started early. He was 7, all skinny elbows and messy hair, and he was currently frowning at a math worksheet. "Hold on, honey," I said, finishing the cappuccino with a heart-shaped swirl of foam, an old trick I rarely bothered with anymore. When I slid it across to Ethan, his eyes widened slightly at the design. "Impressive," he said, picking up the cup. "Guess you do believe in foam after all." I shrugged, but his smile lingered as he walked away. Back at the booth, Ben looked up at me. "Who was that?" he asked, too casually for a 7-year-old. "A neighbor," I said, adjusting his backpack strap. "He just moved in upstairs." Ben narrowed his eyes in the suspicious way kids do when they sense something unspoken. "He looks like he's rich." I choked on a laugh. "Why do you say that?" "His shoes," Ben said matter-of-factly. "People with shiny shoes usually have money." I brushed his hair back from his forehead. "Well, not everything shiny means rich, kiddo." But I couldn't shake the observation. Ethan did look like someone who didn't worry about overdue bills or the cost of school lunches. And yet, he had chosen to live in our building, the one with paint peeling in the stairwell and a landlord who disappeared whenever the heat broke. By the time the morning rush slowed, Ethan had gone, leaving only his cup and a folded receipt with a tip tucked beneath it. I picked it up, half expecting a phone number scribbled across the back. Instead, there was a small note in clean handwriting. "Thanks for the meadow." I felt ridiculous smiling at it. But in a life where most notes I received were bills or overdue warnings, a scrap of paper with a simple thank you felt like a treasure. Later, as I walked Ben to school, his small hand in mine, he asked again, "So, is he your friend?" I hesitated. "Not yet," I said, "but maybe." Ben kicked at a loose stone on the sidewalk, considering that answer. Then, with the blunt honesty of a child, he said, "Just don't let him make you sad, Mom." His words clung to me like the morning chill. I kissed his head before sending him into the schoolyard, and as I turned toward the cafe again, I realized I was both terrified and curious about what this stranger, Ethan, might bring into our lives. Because for the first time in years, something as ordinary as a cappuccino felt like the beginning of a story. By Thursday, the week was already gnawing at me. Rent was due. The electricity bill was glaring from the stack of envelopes on the kitchen counter, and Ben had outgrown his sneakers again. I had patched them once with glue, then again with duct tape, but no amount of creativity could stop the fact that his toes were practically begging for freedom. That morning, I sat at the kitchen table with a calculator that had lost 2 of its buttons. I punched numbers anyway, trying to stretch the paycheck from the cafe across bills, groceries, and school supplies. The math didn't add up. It never did. "Mom, can I get the blue sneakers? The ones with the lightning bolt?" Ben asked, swinging his legs as he munched on cereal. I looked at his socked feet sticking out of shoes that barely closed. My chest tightened. "We'll see, honey. Maybe next week." He nodded, though disappointment flickered in his eyes. Kids are resilient, but they know more than we think. By the time I reached the cafe, I was already raw inside. I tried to bury it in routine, wiping tables, brewing coffee, exchanging quick words with regulars. Around noon, when the lunch lull settled, the door chimed, and Ethan walked in. He wasn't in a suit this time. His sleeves were rolled up, his tie gone, the first 2 buttons of his shirt undone. He looked less like the polished stranger from the rooftop and more like someone caught between worlds. Serious but relaxed. "Back again?" I asked, masking the nerves that sparked in my chest. "Addicted," he said lightly, "but not just to the coffee." The words caught me off guard. Before I could form a reply, he leaned on the counter. "You look tired today." I blinked, defensive. I always look tired. Comes with the job. He studied me for a moment, not in a way that felt invasive, but in a way that made me feel seen. Then, without another word, he ordered his cappuccino. I made it quickly, pouring foam into another meadow. He smiled when I slid it across. As he lingered by the counter, the bell on the door rang again. A delivery man entered, arms full of boxes. I signed the receipt, but my stomach dropped when I realized what one of the boxes contained. A new shipment of syrups, extra expense. Another thing to track in the ledger. Ethan noticed the tension in my face. "Everything okay?" I forced a smile. "Fine, just business." But later that afternoon, as I counted the register, I realized we were short. Tips hadn't been enough to cover the day's dip in sales. My boss had already warned me, if revenue didn't improve, hours would be cut, and if hours were cut, rent would slip further out of reach. That night, after putting Ben to bed, I climbed to the rooftop again. The city buzzed below, lights blinking like stars that had fallen to earth. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to breathe out the weight of the day. The door creaked. Of course it did. Ethan stepped out, a familiar silhouette now. He didn't speak at first, just joined me at the ledge, both of us looking at the river glinting in the distance. "You come up here often," he said finally. "It's cheaper than therapy," I muttered. That earned a quiet laugh, then silence. Comfortable, somehow. After a while, he said, I know I'm just a neighbor and it's none of my business, but you seem like you're carrying more than one person should. I turned to him, surprised by the gentleness in his tone. Welcome to single parenthood, I said. It's like juggling fire while walking a tightrope, and the audience still complains you're not entertaining enough. His smile softened, and yet here you are, still standing. I wanted to deflect, to brush it off with sarcasm, but the words landed in a place I didn't know was hungry, still standing. It sounded like a victory I hadn't let myself claim. We stood in silence for another few minutes. Then, without looking at me, he added, If you ever need help, just ask. The offer sat between us, heavy and dangerous, because help always came with strings, and I had sworn after the divorce never to let myself be tangled again. Thanks, I said quietly, but I've got it. He didn't push. He just nodded, eyes still on the skyline, but I felt the shift, the subtle reminder that my rooftop wasn't just mine anymore. And maybe, against my better judgment, I didn't hate that. Friday nights are supposed to feel like release, but for me, they usually feel like a balancing act between exhaustion and responsibility. After closing the cafe, I dragged myself home with a grocery bag that cost more than I'd budgeted. Inside were the basics: pasta, canned soup, milk for Ben. I'd skipped the sneakers. My chest still ached from the way he had looked at me when I said maybe next week. Ben was sprawled on the living room rug, building something with Legos. Hey, champ, I said, dropping the groceries on the counter. Hungry? Always, he said without looking up. I boiled pasta while he explained his creation, a spaceship shaped more like a crooked box. But in his mind, it was the vessel that would take him to Mars. His voice was full of certainty, the kind only children have. For a moment, I let myself believe in Mars too. Then the lights flickered, once, twice, and then darkness swallowed the apartment. Mom? Ben's voice was small, worried. It's okay, honey, I said quickly, fumbling for my phone flashlight. I'd known the electricity bill was overdue, but I hadn't expected them to cut it so soon. My stomach dropped as I lit the room with a weak glow. Ben's spaceship gleamed in the pale light, fragile and unfinished. We'll camp, I said, forcing brightness into my tone. Remember when we camped in the living room last summer? We'll do that again. Ben's face relaxed, though his eyes still held a shadow of worry. We spread a blanket on the floor, ate pasta by flashlight, and I told him stories about explorers who didn't need lights to find their way. But when he finally drifted off to sleep beside me, his small hand clutching mine, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much longer I could pretend we were just camping. The next day, I carried my fatigue into the cafe like a hidden bruise. By mid-afternoon, the place had quieted down, and I was wiping the counter when the door chimed. Ethan walked in. He looked sharper than usual, suit jacket perfectly fitted, polished shoes catching the light. He was dressed for a meeting, not coffee. Afternoon, Claire, he said warmly. Back again? I asked, trying not to sound like my heart had skipped at the sight of him. I needed a break, he said, and your coffee's better than the hotel kind. Hotel? I raised an eyebrow. Business conference, he explained, sliding onto a stool at the counter. They're serving sludge. I had to escape. I made his cappuccino, though my hands felt heavier than usual. He noticed. Rough night? I stiffened. Define rough. You look like someone who hasn't slept much. I wanted to tell him it was none of his business, but instead, words tumbled out before I could stop them. They cut the power. His expression shifted instantly. Concern, not pity. Claire, don't, I said quickly, more sharply than I intended. I don't need saving. It's just, Temporary. I'll figure it out. He studied me, his cappuccino untouched. You don't have to do everything alone. I laughed, bitter and low. That's exactly what being a single mom is. Doing everything alone, whether you want to or not. For a moment, silence stretched between us, filled only by the hum of the coffee machine. Then, softly, he said, maybe it doesn't have to be. Something in his voice made me pause, my hand resting on the counter. There was no arrogance in his tone, no suggestion that he could swoop in like some hero. Just sincerity, dangerous sincerity. I looked away. Your cappuccino's getting cold. That night, when Ben was asleep again, I climbed to the rooftop. The city lights glowed like a map of possibilities I couldn't reach. The air was cooler, sharper, and when the door creaked, I wasn't surprised anymore. Ethan joined me without a word. We stood side by side, staring out at the skyline. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then, quietly, I said, I don't want to owe anyone. He turned his head, his profile sharp in the nightlight. Maybe it's not about owing. Maybe it's about sharing the weight. The words sank deep, unsettling me, because I wanted to believe them, and wanting was the most dangerous thing of all. By the following week, the rhythm of my days had shifted in a way I hadn't meant for it to. I caught myself listening for the door at the rooftop. I noticed when Ethan skipped a morning at the café. It was like someone had threaded a new melody under the humdrum of my life, quiet but insistent. On Tuesday, just as I was wiping down the espresso machine, Ethan walked in with the kind of determined stride that usually meant someone was about to demand a refund. But his expression wasn't angry. It was expectant. Claire, he said, sliding a folded newspaper onto the counter. There's a street fair tonight. Food stalls, music. Come with me. I blinked at him. That sounds suspiciously like a date. He smirked. Only if you want it to be. The safe answer would have been no. I had rent overdue, laundry piling in the corner, and a son whose sneakers still barely fit. But something in me itched for a yes. The part that remembered what it felt like to be looked at as more than just a mother, a barista, or a woman keeping her head above water. I can't, I said automatically. Then, after a beat, unless Ben comes too. Ethan's smile widened. Then, it's a family outing. That evening, we walked through streets lined with food trucks and string lights. The air smelled of grilled corn, roasted nuts, and fried dough. Ben's eyes lit up at the sight of it all, and I realized it had been years since I'd taken him anywhere that felt festive. Ethan bought him a stick of cotton candy larger than his head. Don't tell your dentist, Ethan said, handing it over. Ben laughed, his face sticky within seconds. I tried to protest, but my son's grin was worth more than my pride. We strolled together, weaving between crowds, and for once, I didn't feel the weight of being the only adult responsible for every detail. Ethan walked beside me like it was natural, carrying the bag of snacks, steadying me when someone bumped my shoulder. At one point, we passed a small stage where a folk band was playing. Couples danced clumsily in the street, shoes scuffing pavement, laughter rising above the music. Ben tugged my sleeve. Dance, Mom. I shook my head. Not happening. But Ethan stepped closer, a glimmer in his eyes. Why not? Because I'm terrible, I said. That makes two of us, he replied, offering his hand. I stared at it, then at him. He wasn't teasing, he wasn't pushing, just waiting. Against my better judgment, I let him lead me into the crowd. The music was fast, the rhythm impossible, and within seconds I was stepping on his shoes. He laughed, deep and unguarded, and soon I was laughing too. People spun around us, clapping and shouting, and for the first time in years, I forgot to be careful. Ben cheered from the sidelines, his cotton candy long gone. You're so bad, he shouted. We know, I yelled back, and Ethan's grin widened. When the song ended, we stumbled out of the crowd, breathless. My cheeks ached from smiling. I couldn't remember the last time I'd smiled that much. We bought lemonade and sat on the curb, watching strangers pass by. Ben leaned against me, already drowsy. Ethan glanced at us, something unreadable in his expression. "You're good at this," he said softly. "At what?" "Making the ordinary feel better." The words warmed me in a way I wasn't prepared for. I looked away, focusing on the twinkling lights above the stalls. "Don't give me too much credit. It's just fried dough and bad dancing." He shook his head. "No, it's more than that." We walked home together, Ben half asleep on my shoulder. At the apartment entrance, I hesitated, keys in hand. Ethan didn't push, didn't ask to come in. He just smiled and said, "Thanks for tonight." I nodded, heart unsteady. "Thanks for the meadow," I whispered, before I could stop myself, echoing his earlier note. His eyes softened. "Any time." When I finally closed the door behind me, I leaned against it, the sound of the city muffled outside. For once, the apartment didn't feel so small. Children have a way of seeing through people in a way adults forget how to. I noticed it the next morning, when Ben sat at the kitchen table drawing while I scrambled eggs. His crayons moved furiously across the page, bright blue and red lines that twisted into something that looked like a storm. "What you drawing, champ?" I asked, sliding a plate toward him. He shrugged, not looking up. "Spaceships." But when I leaned closer, I saw the figures, one small, one tall, both standing under a sky full of stars. "Looks like you and me," I said softly. He finally glanced up, his eyes serious. "And him." He tapped the taller figure with his crayon. "Ethan?" Ben nodded, then stabbed the paper with his blue crayon until it broke in half. "Why is he around so much?" I hesitated. Kids don't always ask directly, but when they do, it cuts like a knife. "He's just a friend," I said. "A neighbor." Ben frowned. "He buys me stuff. Cotton candy, lemonade. Dad used to do that too." Then he left. My chest tightened. Divorce had left scars I couldn't see, but felt every day, especially in moments like this. I crouched beside him. "Sweetheart, Ethan isn't your dad, and he isn't trying to replace him." "Then what does he want?" Ben asked bluntly. Before I could answer, the doorbell rang. Ben's face darkened. "See? He's here again." It was Ethan. Of course it was. Standing in the hallway, holding a bag that smelled faintly of roasted chicken. "I thought maybe you could use a night off from cooking," he said. I wanted to refuse, to keep the boundary clear, but the smell made my stomach rumble, and Ben's eyes flickered despite his frown. I stepped aside. "Come in." Dinner was awkward. Ben pushed peas around his plate, silent except for the occasional sigh. Ethan tried telling him about when he was Ben's age, obsessed with building kites that never flew. But Ben's answers were clipped, suspicious. Afterward, when I tucked him into bed, he whispered, "I don't trust him." I brushed his hair back. "It's okay not to. Trust takes time." He looked at me with wide, searching eyes. "Do you trust him?" The question silenced me. Did I? I trusted that he wasn't pretending with me, at least not in the way people usually pretend, but beyond that, I didn't know. Later, I found Ethan waiting on the rooftop. He leaned against the ledge, the city lights painting shadows across his face. "Rough dinner," he said with a small smile. I sighed. He's protective. It's been just him and me for a long time. "I get it," Ethan said. "I don't expect him to like me right away." His voice was steady, but there was something in his eyes. Patience. Maybe even vulnerability. It unnerved me. Ethan, I said carefully, I can't let him get attached unless I know. I trailed off, the words too heavy to finish. Unless I know you'll stay. Unless I know this isn't just a distraction for you. He didn't push me to finish. He just nodded, turning back toward the skyline. Fair enough. We stood in silence, the weight of unspoken promises hanging between us. For the first time, I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. Ben's heart was in the balance, fragile and breakable, and that terrified me more than any overdue bill ever could. It started small, the way whispers always do. A glance here, a raised eyebrow there. By the time it reached me, the words were no longer whispers, but questions sharpened into judgments. At the café, while I stacked cups behind the counter, my coworker Lydia leaned close. "So Claire," she said in a tone dripping with mock innocence, "who's the guy? The tall one in the suit who keeps coming in for your cappuccinos?" I tried to keep my voice casual. "Just a neighbor." "Uh-huh," Lydia smirked. "Funny how neighbors don't usually tip $20 for foam." I rolled my eyes, but her comment clung to me long after she wandered off. Customers noticed too, Mrs. Donnelly, one of our regulars, gave me a pointed smile when Ethan sat at the corner table again. "Nice to see you've got company," she said, stirring her tea like she was mixing secrets into it. Even at Ben's school, I felt the change. On Friday morning, as I dropped him off, one of the moms, perfect hair, perfect car, perfect life, gave me a look that was half pity, half warning. "New man in your life?" she asked too loudly. I forced a polite smile. "Just a friend." Her eyes flicked to Ben, then back to me. "Be careful. Kids notice more than you think." The words stung, not because they were wrong, but because they were true. That evening, back in the apartment, Ben slammed his backpack on the floor. "Everyone at school keeps asking if Ethan is my new dad," he muttered. My throat tightened. "What did you say?" "That he's not," but they laughed anyway. His face crumpled and I crouched to hold him, wishing I could shield him from every careless word. Later I climbed to the rooftop, needing air. Ethan was already there, leaning against the ledge with his jacket slung over one shoulder. He turned as I stepped out, his expression softening. "Long day?" he asked. "Try long week," I said, walking toward him. The city glowed below us, indifferent to my troubles. "People are talking." "About us?" I nodded, hugging my arms around myself. "It's not just me anymore. Ben hears it. Parents at school, my coworkers. They make it sound like I'm reckless, dragging him into something unstable." Ethan's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "You're not reckless. You're human. You deserve more than bills and exhaustion." I laughed bitterly. Tell that to the world that thinks single moms are supposed to sacrifice forever. He stepped closer, close enough that the warmth of him cut through the night air. "You don't owe anyone an explanation, Claire. Not your coworkers, not the other parents. Just yourself. And Ben." The way he said Ben's name, gentle, careful, sent a shiver through me. Because that was the heart of it. My son. His heart. His trust. The one thing I couldn't gamble with. I looked out over the city, lights blurring through the mist. I don't know if I can handle being judged again. I barely survived the last time. Ethan didn't answer right away. Then, quietly, he said, "Maybe this time. You don't have to survive it alone." The words hung between us, fragile and terrifying. For a heartbeat, I let myself imagine it. Partnership, support, someone at my side. Then I pulled back, because dreams like that had sharp edges when they broke. Still, when I returned to the apartment, I realized something had shifted. The gossip hadn't crushed me. It had forced me to admit what I was afraid of. Not the judgment, but the possibility of wanting something real again. The truth arrived on an ordinary morning, the way life likes to disguise its detonations. I was wiping down the cafe counter, humming along to the old radio that crackled in the background, when the door swung open and a gust of autumn air swept in. 3 men in suits entered first. Sharp, efficient, like chess pieces come to life. They scanned the room, their eyes skimming past the customers, until they landed on the man who followed them in. Ethan. But not the Ethan I knew from the rooftop or the street fair. This Ethan wore a tailored suit that looked carved onto his frame, his tie a silk stripe that whispered money. His hair was neatly styled, his posture radiating authority. He didn't look like my neighbor. He looked like someone who owned the building, the block, maybe the whole city. The suits flanked him like bodyguards. One carried a leather folder, another tapped his earpiece. I froze mid-wipe, cloth in hand, my heart thudding. Ethan's eyes flicked to me, and for a fraction of a second, I saw a flash of the man I recognized. Then his expression smoothed into something practiced, distant. "Mr. Carter," one of the suits said, holding the door. "Your driver is ready when you are." Carter. I gripped the counter, the name echoing in my head. I'd heard it before, in news headlines and snippets on the cafe TV, in articles about corporate mergers. Ethan Carter, CEO of Carter & Wynn Enterprises, the man whose company controlled half the office towers in the city. I stared at him, the reality slamming into me like cold water. The cappuccinos, the rooftop talks, the street fair. It hadn't been a level playing field. He wasn't just my neighbor. He was someone from a world I couldn't even afford to glance at. He must have seen the shock on my face, because his eyes softened as he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Claire." I cut him off. "Ethan Carter?" The suits turned, curious, but he waved them off. His voice was quiet, almost pleading. "I wanted to tell you. I just didn't want it to change things." "Didn't want it to change things?" My laugh came out sharp, brittle. "You're the CEO of a corporation, and you've been hanging around like you're just another guy in the building. Do you have any idea what that feels like? To find out from strangers like I'm the last to know?" Customers were staring now. The cafe suddenly hushed. My cheeks burned. I shoved the cloth into the sink and ripped off my apron. "Enjoy your coffee, Mr. Carter?" I spat and stormed into the back room. I didn't see him leave. I only heard the jingle of the door and the quiet murmur of whispers spreading like wildfire. That night, I didn't go to the rooftop. I couldn't. Every time I thought of his face, I saw not the neighbor who danced clumsily with me under string lights, but the CEO who'd hidden his life behind pressed shirts and half-truths. Ben noticed my silence at dinner. "You're mad," he said simply. "Not at you," I answered quickly, forcing a smile. "At him," he said. I didn't answer, but my son didn't need one. Kids see more than we admit. When I finally crawled into bed, I stared at the ceiling, the dark pressing in. For years, I'd lived on the edge of survival, clinging to honesty, because lies had already broken me once. And now, just when I'd let myself believe in something again, I'd been blindsided. The city outside glittered with lights, but inside, everything felt dimmer. The next few days were a blur of silence. I went to work, brewed cappuccinos, smiled at customers who whispered when they thought I couldn't hear. Apparently, news travels fast when the neighborhood cafe is suddenly the stage for a CEO's unmasking. Some people asked outright, half joking, "So, Claire, when are you marrying Rich?" I laughed them off, but inside, I was crumbling. Ethan didn't come by. Not to the cafe, not to the rooftop. His absence gnawed at me more than his lie had. I hated that part of me kept listening for his knock on the apartment door. On the third night, as I was sorting laundry in the cramped kitchen, there was a knock. My heart leapt before my mind could stop it. I opened the door and found him standing there. No suit this time. Just jeans, a simple sweater, his hair mussed like he hadn't slept. Claire, he began, his voice low. I crossed my arms. Mr. Carter, he winced. Don't, please. I didn't move aside. You lied to me. I didn't lie, he said quickly. I just didn't tell you everything. I laughed bitterly. That's the definition of lying by omission. He ran a hand through his hair, looking suddenly less like the polished CEO and more like the neighbor who once danced badly in the street. I wanted to be normal for once, to walk into a cafe and not have people treat me like I'm some headline, to stand on a rooftop and just breathe. And with you, I had that. You didn't look at me like I was a paycheck. You looked at me. His words pressed against the walls I'd built, but I held them firm. And now I feel like the idiot who didn't see the obvious. You're not an idiot, he said fiercely. You're the only person who's ever made me feel... He stopped himself, swallowing hard. Claire, I didn't mean to hurt you. I just didn't know how to tell you without losing what we had. I shook my head. You don't get it. I've lived my whole life with half-truths. My ex promised me forever while cheating behind my back. He said he wanted to build a life, and instead he walked out, leaving me with bills and a child who asks why Dad doesn't come around anymore. I can't... My voice broke. I can't survive being lied to again, Ethan. He stepped forward, but I backed away. I'm not him, he said quietly. I'm not going to vanish. Ben's door creaked open, and he stood there, sleepy-eyed in his pajamas. Mom? His gaze flicked to Ethan. Why is he here? I froze. Ethan looked at him gently, to apologize. Ben frowned, suspicious as always. Are you gonna leave again? Ethan crouched, meeting his eyes. No, not unless your mom wants me to. Ben looked at me. The weight of his gaze was heavier than any bill, any judgment. He was asking me to decide. For him, for us. I cleared my throat, my voice unsteady. Go back to bed, honey. We'll talk later. He shuffled away, but his words lingered like ghosts. Are you gonna leave again? I turned back to Ethan. My hand shook as I gripped the counter. I need time, space. Whatever this is, it can't be rushed. Not with him watching. Ethan nodded slowly, pain flickering across his face. I'll wait, however long it takes. Psha. When he left, the apartment felt heavier, not lighter, because now it wasn't just a question of whether I could forgive him. It was whether I could forgive myself for wanting to. The crisis didn't come in the form of bills or gossip. It came in the form of a fever. It was Saturday night when Ben stumbled into the kitchen, cheeks flushed, eyes glassy. He clutched his stomach and whispered, Mom, I don't feel good. By the time I touched his forehead, panic tightened my chest. He was burning up. I bundled him in a blanket, grabbed my purse, and rushed out the door. The nearest clinic was 5 blocks away, but every step felt like a mile. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and despair. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Ben slumped against me, his small hand hot in mine. I filled out forms with trembling fingers, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Claire? I turned. Ethan stood there breathless, as if he had run straight from somewhere important. He wore no suit tonight, only a jacket thrown hastily over a t-shirt. His eyes flicked to Ben, then to me. What happened? Fever, I said tightly. He said his stomach hurts. They're checking him now. Ethan nodded and sat beside me without asking, his presence grounding me even as my instincts screamed to keep distance. When the nurse finally called us, Ethan followed. No one stopped him. He carried himself with a quiet authority that opened doors. In the small examination room, I sat on the edge of the bed while the doctor pressed on Ben's stomach, checked his throat, listened to his breathing. Looks like a nasty flu, the doctor said at last. We'll keep him overnight for fluids and observation. Relief hit so hard my knees went weak. I nodded, blinking back tears. Through it all, Ethan stayed. He fetched water, filled out paperwork, when my hands shook too much, even cracked a joke that made Ben manage a weak smile. Watching him, I saw not the CEO, not the man in headlines, but someone steady and present, someone who didn't flinch when things got messy. Hours later, when Ben finally slept, I stepped into the hallway, exhausted. Ethan joined me, his shoulders slumping for the first time. "You didn't have to stay," I said quietly. "I did," he replied simply, "because this is what matters. Not boardrooms, not suits. This." He gestured toward the door where Ben lay sleeping. The sincerity in his voice shook me. For years I'd believed I had to carry everything alone. And here was a man who had stepped willingly into the chaos without asking for anything in return. "I'm scared," I admitted, my voice breaking. "Every time I let someone close, it ends with me and him." I nodded toward the door. "Picking up the pieces." Ethan's gaze was steady. "Then let me prove I won't leave you with pieces." The hallway was quiet except for the hum of machines. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to. But belief was dangerous. Still, when he reached for my hand, I didn't pull away. For the first time, I let someone else share the weight, even if it was just for one fragile night. When Ben was discharged from the clinic 2 days later, pale but smiling, I thought the worst was behind us. But the storm had only just begun. On Monday morning, I walked into the café to find Lydia waiting with her phone out, the screen shoved in my face before I even set my bag down. "Claire," she whispered dramatically, "you're famous." I blinked at the screen. A photo filled it, me and Ethan sitting in the clinic hallway. My head bent toward him, his hand over mine. The caption screamed, "Mysterious woman spotted with CEO Ethan Carter, single mom from local cafe." My stomach plummeted. Customers were already buzzing, glancing at me with open curiosity. Whispers swirled like smoke. "That's her, the one from the article." By the time my shift ended, the story had spread further. Parents at Ben's school whispered when I dropped him off. My landlord suddenly called about checking in on the rent. Even Mrs. Donnelly, who usually only commented on the weather, leaned in and murmured, "Careful, dear. Men like that don't marry cafe girls." That night, I stormed up to the rooftop, fury crackling in my chest. Ethan was already there, as if he knew I'd come. He held a folded newspaper in his hand, the same photo plastered across the front page. "I'm sorry," he said before I could speak. "I tried to keep them away, but once the story broke—" "Story?" My voice shook. "This isn't a story, Ethan. This is my life, my son's life, and now it's in headlines for strangers to pick apart." He stepped closer, desperation flickering in his eyes. "I'll protect you, both of you. I'll make it stop." "You can't," I snapped. "You can't control gossip or headlines or people who think I'm nothing more than a distraction. I lived through judgment once already. I barely survived. I won't drag Ben through it again." Silence stretched. His jaw tightened. "So what are you saying?" I stared at him, heart aching. "I'm saying I can't do this. Not like this. Not with the whole world watching." For a long moment he didn't move. Then he nodded slowly, as if the weight of my words was pressing him into the ground. "If walking away keeps you safe, then I'll step back." Tears burned behind my eyes, but I forced myself to hold steady. "I'm sorry." I left him on the rooftop, his silhouette etched against the city lights, a figure torn between two worlds. Back in my apartment, I closed the door, locked it, and slid down against the wood, trembling. Ben's soft breathing drifted from his room. He was safe. That had to be enough. But as I sat in the dark, I couldn't shake the truth gnawing at me. Safety didn't feel like living, and letting him go felt like losing something I hadn't even allowed myself to fully claim. The rooftop felt different that night, colder, sharper, as if the city itself had shifted since the last time I stood there. I hadn't been back in days, not since I told Ethan I couldn't do this. But the weight in my chest wouldn't leave me alone. Bills, gossip, judgment, those were old burdens, ones I'd carried for years. The new weight was absence. Ben was asleep, finally healthy again, curled under his blanket with his spaceship Legos at the foot of the bed. I kissed his forehead, whispered goodnight, then climbed the stairs I thought I'd sworn off. The heavy door groaned open, and there he was, Ethan, alone, leaning against the ledge, hands shoved into his pockets. The skyline stretched behind him, glittering, indifferent. He turned when he heard me, surprise flashing across his face before it softened into something quieter. I didn't think I'd see you here again. Neither did I admitted, stepping into the cold air. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The city hummed below, 1,000 lives moving without knowing mine was caught between fear and longing. Finally, I said, I've spent so much time trying to survive, to keep Ben safe, to keep the lights on, to hold everything together with duct tape and coffee grounds. And then you came along, and I don't know if I'm strong enough to want something more. Ethan's eyes searched mine, steady and unflinching. Wanting doesn't make you weak, Claire. Pretending you don't want... He shook his head. That's what breaks people. I laughed softly, bitter and tender all at once. You make it sound simple. It isn't, he said. It's complicated, messy, and it'll hurt sometimes. But I'm not asking you to gamble everything. I'm asking you to let me stand here, beside you, while you carry it. The wind tugged at my hair, the city breathing around us. For the first time, I realized I wasn't afraid of him leaving. I was afraid of me not trying. Afraid of teaching Ben that love is always a mistake instead of a risk worth taking. I stepped closer until the distance between us felt surmountable. I can't promise forever, I whispered, but I can promise today, and maybe tomorrow. His shoulders loosened as if he'd been holding his breath for weeks. He reached out, not to pull me in, not to claim me, but simply to hold my hand. Warm, steady, human. We stood there like that, two people stitched together by the mess of life, staring at a skyline that suddenly seemed less lonely. Somewhere below, the world would keep whispering. The bills would still come. The judgments would still sting. But here, on this cracked rooftop with a broken satellite dish in the corner, I allowed myself the smallest, most terrifying act of hope, believing that love, even fragile, could be part of survival. And for the first time in years, the rooftop didn't feel like escape. It felt like beginning.